When most people are asked what Marxism is, either getting, I don't know, or if they're conservative,
it's oppression, it's exile, it's death.
From the border to the currency to inflation, the price of food, the price of gasoline, the price of toys and plastics and steel.
I call it corporate communism. Corporate communism destroys small businesses in America.
It's fired for calling out critical race theory in the military.
Biden's saying, oh, the government's not going to mandate vaccines, but the big corporations are doing it.
So basically everything they dislike. Some might say communism or socialism, but that isn't exactly right either. So what is Marxism? Well, all you gals and gents, this is Axolotl Aristotle here to explain it. Obviously, this video will be a brief summary of the overall Marxist viewpoint. I'll be focusing on freedom and historical material dialectics, which means a lot of detail like surplus labor, credit, monopolies, trusts, etc. they won't make it in. If you like what you see, however, I'll eventually make videos on those topics, so feel free to subscribe. That being said, yes, freedom is at the core of Marxism. The goal of the Marxist is to provide the greatest freedom possible to humanity, which, according to Engels, is the ascent of man from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. What Engels is saying is that true freedom is when someone is free from the constraints nature imposes on them, free from dying of hunger, free from the elements, free from disease. How we get to that point will be discussed later in the video. Now, our proponents, oftentimes conservatives, will deny that we want to provide freedom and instead assert that we want to take away all your current ones. But considering this is the same group of people that would rather restrict freedom in order to protect their symbol of freedom,
we ought to come up with legislation that if you burn the American flag, you go to jail for 1 year. 1 year.
Maybe we shouldn't take them seriously? Alright, we've established the end goal of Marxism. Now, it's just a matter of getting there. Funnily enough, I want to begin by discussing a political philosopher and obvious capitalist, Francis Fukuyama. In 1992, he published a book where the main claim was that with the fall of the USSR, Western liberal democracy and capitalism had won. There'd be no need for a new ideology. History has ended. I'm serious, it's literally the title of the book. But wait a minute, what's that sound?
No! No!
Okay, clearly capitalism isn't the end of history, but what does that have to do with Marxism? Well, Marx himself was a historian and used his knowledge of history to reinterpret Hegelian dialectics. For Marx, humanity's development rested on the class conflicts that were brought about by the means of production of goods, basically the technology of the time, what those goods happen to be, and the exchange of those goods, i.e. the economy. While we can go over humanity's development as a whole, due to the constraints of this video being a brief summary, I'll be focusing solely on the shift from feudalism to capitalism. In feudalism, the class conflict was largely between the feudal lords of the land and the peasants who, in return for being allowed to live on that land, worked to provide food for the lord and themselves. The technology of the time was constricted to the use of one person, an individual. That person would make the item from scratch and therefore own it. Also, there was no system of production. No exact amount the peasant knew they had to make in order to satisfy both their needs and the lord's fee. This is because the latter could often be changed on a whim due to circumstances the peasant knew nothing of. Therefore, without a real plan, the peasant would produce as much as they could with all of their resources. It was anarchy. Usually it was just enough to satisfy both needs, but occasionally they overproduced and had some extra items that they either sold or traded. Even in feudal society, the capitalistic mode of exchange was beginning to blossom. Now, the reason feudalism morphed into capitalism was due to the betterment of technology. To quote Engels, the spinning wheel, the hand loom, the blacksmith's hammer were replaced by the spinning machine, the power loom, the steam hammer. This technology, while also rapidly increasing output, also changed a key factor: the system of development. No longer was an individual able to make an item by themselves. They had to work with others to operate this machinery. Production became socialized. Output was greatly increased and cost greatly reduced. Individual producers in each industry were eventually unable to compete with this socialized production. They were forced to join the very system that destroyed them. The burgeoning capitalist class who owned this machinery was unable to profit fully from it, constrained by the feudalistic system where you could only have wealth and power based on who you were born to. To them, feudalism no longer had any use, so eventually they overthrew and replaced it. Now that's all well and good, you might say, but what does this historical trend have to do with reaching the Marxist goal of freedom? Aren't we free already under capitalism? Well, as I alluded to earlier when making fun of Fukuyama, capitalism is an inherently volatile system. This is in part due to capitalism inheriting some key ideas from feudalism. Remember when I referenced production under feudalism as anarchy? Where everyone makes as much as possible due to not knowing how much needs to be produced? It's the same under capitalism. Except, instead of trying to satisfy their basic needs of survival, the goal is to make as much money as possible. In order to make more money, they have to sell more things. And to sell more things, they have to make more things. So here's how it works. Capitalist businesses produce as much as they can while simultaneously investing their money into building more and more factories to produce even more goods. Eventually, the market is flooded by these goods. Supply overtakes demand, and the market stagnates. Since businesses aren't making money off their product anymore and can't afford many of the factories they own, they either close some of them, or if they go bankrupt, all of them. When factories close down, the workers are fired. Without an income, they cannot buy food, shelter, or medicine. So, my question is, how can you be considered free? Free from hunger, free from the elements, and free from disease if the only way you can prevent those things is by working in a system that is set to, as the phrase of many Marxists goes, collapse every 10 years, putting you at risk to lose your supposed freedom and security. Even outside of a market crisis, your freedom is at risk. Capitalists want to lower costs as much as possible, and one way they do that is by investing heavily in new machinery and technology, the means of production. When this machinery is improved, oftentimes it requires less people to operate, it increases output, and/or makes it easier to use. You can be let go from your job because production became easier, because there's no longer a spot at the machine for you to operate at. That means getting hired becomes harder too, even if there isn't a crisis, because this technology will eventually be available to every business, and they'll have less and less need of the workers. Also, it's important to note that even if you have a job, especially near or at minimum wage, not only will you lack the funds to afford food and housing, but oftentimes you won't get good benefits like health insurance, paid time off, sick days, consistent hours, etc. Now, if you don't believe me about the former, check out the living wage calculator, which deduces what the average person needs to make in order to survive. It's a really neat tool that you can use to find out what the minimum wage is where you live versus what you need to be making in order to live comfortably. I'll leave a link to it below in the description. As for the latter issue, these are just additional costs to the capitalist. They don't want to provide them to you if they don't have to, and since there's unemployment even outside of a crisis, and the means of production becomes so simple to operate that basically anyone can do it, why would they give you vacation time and maternity leave? All the other unemployed people out there are willing to do the same work you do without those benefits, just to have a job to survive. Capitalists don't see unemployment as a problem. In fact, they see it as a boon, or as Engels has put it, an industrial reserve army. Thankfully, there is a solution to this problem of the working class living destitute lives that become worse over time and are always in a false sense of security. The solution is actually located in our current system. Here's a quote by Engels describing how the productive forces that currently hurt us can instead free us. But just as the older manufacturer in its time and handicraft, becoming more developed under its influence, had come into collision with the feudal trammels of the guild, so now modern industry, in its more complete development, comes into collision with the bounds within which the capitalistic mode of production holds it confined. The new productive forces have already outgrown the capitalistic mode of using them. Production's been socialized. It's the bonds of our current economic system that strangle it. Under capitalism, the products are made by many, but owned by one to be sold off in a one-on-one transaction. The profits from said transaction don't go to the workers who actually make the product, but to the already wealthy person who happens to own the expensive machinery. At the whims of the capitalist factory owners, production is an anarchy. They make as much as possible in order to accrue the most money, ignoring the long-term consequences like overproduction, market crashes, high unemployment, and the degrading living conditions of millions of people. I mean, it makes sense though. The goal of capitalism is to accumulate the most money possible. It's literally in the name. If, however, production is socialized, why shouldn't the amount of goods produced be based on the needs of every citizen? Why shouldn't one-on-one transactions made to produce profit instead just be on the basis of from each according to his ability to each according to his needs? The fact we have unemployment now just shows how well our technology of production functions, even when we have production of anarchy. Instead of those currently employed working 40+ hours a week, why not employ everyone for far less hours and better pay? People would then not only be free from hunger, disease, and the elements, but also free to pursue their interests and better themselves in the world. To the Marxist, socialism, and after that communism, are just the next phase of development for humanity. As an aside note, both socialism and communism are about the betterment of everyone, hence the word social and commune, which means community. But we aren't done once we get to communism. The whole point of Marxism is to ensure this freedom. If at some point in the future we find a better system to do that, a true Marxist would abandon socialism and communism in a heartbeat to enact it. We aren't like Fukuyama. We know that history will never end. We can always improve, we can always help more people. That's why, for now at least, all Marxists are socialists and communists, but not all socialists and communists are Marxist. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and comment. If you want to support this channel even more, I also have a Patreon with numerous tiers and rewards like having your name at the end of my videos. Making educational content like this is a blast, and I can do it on a much more consistent basis with your support.